Whereas that turn spared the stragglers and headquarters troops in Longvilly, it trapped Task Force Booth, the small force that Gilbreth had established on high ground to screen Longvilly and his supporting artillery. Having lost radio contact with Gilbreth's headquarters, Colonel Booth during the night decided to try to save his little force by moving cross-country in hope of gaining American lines someplace, he knew not where. At seemingly every turn, the men and light tanks bumped into Germans. Although they managed to back off from those encounters, not quite 3 miles from the starting point at the village of Hardigny, a strong force of tanks and panzer grenadiers cut the little task force to pieces. Eventually, in some cases after up to 6 days of wandering, some 225 men made their way into Bastogne. In mid-afternoon of December 18th, when the advance guard of General Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division and one of the Panzer Grenadier regiments at last broke free of the traffic jam along the road, leading up from the valley of the Clare of Bayerlein, who was forward, split the column at the village of Eschweiler. He planned to take advantage of 2 roads leading toward Bastogne. Bayerlein sent the advance guard up the road on the left, while he himself moved with the Panzer Grenadier Regiment and 15 Mark IV tanks on the right. The road that Bayerlein was travelling led to the Fiach Road junction, but about a mile short of it, Bayerlein took a back road leading directly toward Bastogne. As he made the turn, he could hear the sounds of fighting at Fiach, and fiery tracer bullets gave the night a fantastic aspect. Not long after 6 p.m., Bayerlein and his force drew up at the hamlet of Niederwampach, less than 6 miles from Bastogne. On the verge of victory in the race for Bastogne, Bayerlein pondered how to proceed from there. There were 2 choices. He could turn south to get onto a principal hard-surfaced highway leading from Ettelbruck and the valley of the Sûre River into Bastogne, or he could continue to the west along a side road to get onto the road from Fiach and Longvilly to Bastogne at the village of Majer, 3 miles from Bastogne. Because the side road was the more direct, because Bayerlein knew that American reinforcements would soon be arriving in Bastogne, and because he considered it unlikely that such a minor road would be defended, he chose the side route. Besides, civilians assured him the road was excellent. Nevertheless, concerned about its condition, he employed at first only a platoon of tanks and a company of panzer grenadiers. For a time, Bayerlein worried that he might have made a mistake, for the little road grew progressively worse, until finally it was nothing but a muddy farm track. Yet for the most part, his vehicles managed to traverse it, and at Majer he found only a small detachment of the 158th Engineer Combat Battalion. Soon in control of the village, Bayerlein was preparing to head down the highway toward the goal of Bastogne when he received disturbing news. According to a Belgian man, a large American force with at least 40 tanks and other vehicles, including artillery, had only a short time before passed through Majer, going in the direction of Longvilly. If Bayerlein turned at Majer to move into Bastogne, the American force would be in his rear. He had at that point only his panzer grenadiers, a battery of artillery, and 15 tanks, and much of that force still had to inch forward over the muddy track from Niederwampach. Did he dare turn his back on such a strong American force? Preceding the main body of the 10th Armoured Division's CCB, the commander, Colonel Roberts, reported into General Middleton's headquarters in Bastogne just before 4 p.m. on December 18th. The Heinz barracks was less bustling than usual, for at the direction of the commander of the 12th Army Group, General Bradley, with whom Middleton at that point had much better communications than with his immediate superior, General Hodges. Middleton had already started most of his headquarters troops moving to the rear, retaining only key staff officers and their assistants. He himself was determined to remain, despite admonitions from Bradley to the contrary, until he could brief Roberts and the commander of the Airborne Division. Like most experienced armoured commanders, Colonel Roberts, who had taught armoured doctrine at the Command and General Staff College, was always wary of the way doughboy generals might employ armour. They had a tendency to use it in the fashion that helped bring the downfall of the French army in 1940, not as a powerful massed force, but in increments, often as infantry support. And Middleton Roberts was aware was a doughboy general. Middleton's first question fulfilled all Bill Roberts' concerns: how many teams can you make up? Reluctantly, Roberts responded, 3. Once Roberts had formed the 3 teams, said Middleton, he was to send one north of Bastogne on the Liège highway to the village of Neuville, a second to the southeast to block the highway leading from Ettelbruck, and a third, in fact, the first to be formed to what looked to be at the moment the most threatened point, Longvilly. However much Roberts disagreed with the splitting of his command, he conceded mentally that the Corps commander knew more about the situation than he did. Having had experience with wholesale retreat at Château Thierry in May 1918, Roberts wanted to know what he should do about stragglers. "Sir," he said, "I want authority to use those men." Middleton promptly agreed, and the next morning issued an order specifically authorizing Roberts to take over all or any part of the 9th Armored Division CCR in case they show the slightest inclination to retire. The force that Colonel Roberts sent to Longvilly was Team Cherry, named for Lieutenant Colonel Henry T. Cherry, commander of the 3D Tank Battalion. Cherry had one of his own medium tank companies, 2 light tank platoons, a company of the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion, and a few reconnaissance troops, engineers, and medics. It was Team Cherry that passed through Majer on the way to Longvilly, not long before General Bastogne reached Majer. Team Cherry had, in fact, not 40 tanks as the Belgian had told Bastogne, but only 17 mediums, 10 lights, and no artillery. Whether the Belgians simply overestimated the American strength or deliberately misinformed Bastogne was never determined, for the man was never identified. What mattered in any case was that the word of the American force made Bastogne cautious and delayed even a probe toward Bastogne for 6 hours, and a genuine attack considerably longer than that. Roberts had yet to leave Middleton's headquarters in Bastogne when Middleton had another visitor, the commander of the 101st Airborne Division's artillery, and in General Taylor's absence, the acting division commander, Brig General Anthony C. McAuliffe. When McAuliffe left Camp Mormelon near Rheims, his orders were to go, not to Bastogne, but in accord with the wishes of General Hodges, to Werbemont. He had come by Middleton's headquarters only because he was some distance ahead of the trucks transporting his troops, had some time to spare, and welcomed a chance to find out the situation from Middleton. What McAuliffe could not know was that when the commander of the 82D Airborne Division and acting commander of the 68 Airborne Corps, General Gavin, reached the First Army's headquarters in Spa, he had found Hodges increasingly concerned about the threat posed by Kampfgruppe Piper. Since Gavin's division was ahead of McAuliffe's, Hodges told Gavin to move to Werbemont to stop Piper, while the 101st Airborne Division went to Bastogne. Gavin got that word to his convoy, but it failed to reach McAuliffe's. It did reach General Middleton, and he told McAuliffe. While it was still light, McAuliffe and his G3, Lieutenant Colonel Harry W. O. Kinnard, picked out an assembly area just west of Bastogne, and sent a military policeman to a road junction to divert the march units of the 101st Airborne Division's convoy to Bastogne. Yet some of the march units had already passed the junction. Acting commander of the division artillery because of General McAuliffe's change in roles, Col Thomas L. Sherburne, at the head of the 101st Airborne Division's convoy, was becoming irritated by the accordion-like action of the 82D Airborne Division's convoy ahead of him. Fed up with the constant stop and go, Sherburne paused at a crossroads northwest of Bastogne, wondering whether he might not gain time by detouring on a roundabout route to Werbemont by way of Bastogne. When a sergeant of military police told him that some hours earlier, General McAuliffe and his party had turned toward Bastogne, Sherburne told the MP on duty at the crossroads to divert all march units of the 101st Airborne Division to Bastogne. By that chance development, the division was soon on its way to where the American command wanted and vitally needed it. That was not to say that movement to the assembly area just outside Bastogne was swift. The trucks carrying men of the Airborne Division had to buck heavy traffic generated by service units withdrawing from Bastogne, and officers of those units, under orders to fall back, insisted on priority on the road. In the congestion, once a group of vehicles came to a halt, many a driver dozed off, so that in the end it took MPs moving up and down the column to awaken drivers and keep the traffic flowing in both directions. First units of the 101st Airborne Division nevertheless began arriving in the assembly area near Bastogne around midnight on December 18th. The men were cold and wet, having ridden in big cattle trucks through rain with no overhead cover, and having left Camp Mormelon so hurriedly that many lacked helmets, ammunition, some even weapons, and hardly anybody had overcoats or overshoes. They were to have little sleep and little time to prepare for the battle ahead of them, but what mattered was that they were there. The advance guard of CCB's Team Cherry, commanded by First Lieutenant Edward P. Hyduke, and composed mainly of light tanks and armoured cars, reached the edge of Longvilly around 7 p.m. on the 18th. As far as Hajduk could make out, the village was jammed with men and vehicles of the 9th Armoured Division's CCR. Rather than risk getting his vehicles intermingled with those of CCR, Hajduk halted his column and radioed Colonel Cherry, who came forward and went into Longvilly to talk with CCR's commander, Colonel Gilbreth. Gilbreth was elated to learn of Team Cherry's arrival, for at that hour Task Force Harper was still holding at the Fiach Road junction, and Gilbreth assumed Team Cherry would help. Colonel Cherry quickly squashed the idea. His orders, he said, were to go no farther than Longvilly. Learning that Gilbreth had no plans other than to carry out his orders to hold at all costs, Cherry headed back to Bastogne to explain the situation to Colonel Roberts and get a decision as to where to position his command. He told Lieutenant Hajduk in the meantime to deploy the advance guard in fighting positions on the Bastogne side of Longvilly, thereby avoiding confusion with CCR. Hajduk chose positions on high ground along the highway near a roadside religious shrine, the Grotto of St. Michael. As Colonel Cherry passed back through Majer, General Bayerlein and his tanks and panzer grenadiers had just arrived. Although Cherry's jeep drew some small arms fire, Cherry thought it was from trigger-happy American stragglers, picked up speed, and proceeded on his way. In Bastogne, where Colonel Roberts had yet to receive Middleton's order telling him to prevent CCR from retiring, Roberts told Cherry that should CCR withdraw, Cherry was to cover the withdrawal, but no matter what, Team Cherry was to hold. When Cherry started back, he got no farther than the hamlet of Neff, a half-mile short of Majer, where he had earlier established his headquarters in a nearby chateau. There he learned that at least a strong German patrol was in Majer. By radio, he ordered the commander of the Armoured Infantry Company with Team Cherry, Capt. William F. Ryerson, to send a patrol to open the road through Majer. Ryerson sent 2 squads of armoured infantry in a half-track. Short of the first houses, the men dismounted and made their way on foot to a crossroads in the centre of the village. There they determined that in fact at least 3 German tanks and a company of infantry were in the village, too much for 2 squads to think of tackling. Just as the men were getting ready to pull out, they heard the noise of a tracked vehicle approaching from the rear. Were they to be trapped? After a breathless wait, they found it to be a self-propelled tank destroyer which CCR's commander Colonel Gilbreth had sent to clear Majer. Along with the tank destroyer, the 2 squads withdrew. When Captain Ryerson radioed word on the enemy's strength to Colonel Cherry, Cherry ordered him to leave Lieutenant Hajduk's force as a rear guard and turn the medium tanks and armoured infantry to clear the Germans from Majer. That Ryerson prepared to do, but it was to be a difficult assignment, partly because an ugly situation was about to develop in Longvilly. In late evening of December 18, Colonel Gilbreth faced a crisis. He had lost Task Force Rose and much of Task Force Harper. He had no contact with Task Force Booth and no way of knowing whether it still existed. His own Field Artillery Battalion and the separate 58th Armoured Field Artillery Battalion were under intermittent shelling from German tanks and assault guns and direct pressure from German patrols, and he himself and his headquarters were in what amounted to the front line, no place from which to direct a battle. Shortly before midnight, Gilbreth told his staff and headquarters troops to prepare to withdraw to Bastogne, while the combat troops, mainly the men, half-tracks and tanks that had fallen back from the Fiach Road junction, were to stay behind to hold Longvilly and screen the artillery. Word for the headquarters troops to withdraw went out in a grim setting. Pitch darkness, a clinging fog, German searchlights in the distance, fiery arcs of tracer bullets, eerie flickers of flares. There was shelling, the occasional chatter of burp guns from German patrols, and everywhere untold confusion. To many a man it looked like Armageddon, and somewhere just over a hill or 2, maybe 3, there was a place where he could escape it, Bastogne. There was no way to confine word of the withdrawal to the few who were supposed to execute it, and for men who had just experienced the enemy's deadly power at the Fiach Road junction, it was easy to convince themselves that the order to fall back applied to them too. At the appointed hour for men of the headquarters to depart, seemingly every man, every vehicle, every gun in Longvilly converged on the western exit from the village. Soon there was panic, an ugly panic. Somehow Colonel Gilbreth and his staff managed to stop it. Gilbreth cut the column in the middle and ordered that not another vehicle, not another man, including the headquarters troops, was to leave Longvilly until daylight. Yet in the meantime, Those vehicles that had succeeded in getting out of the village added to the congestion already created on the narrow highway leading to Majer by the presence of Team Cherry's half-tracks and tanks. On the German side that night, the commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, General von Wiltz, unaware that American reinforcements had reached Bastogne, but expecting them at any time, ordered an all-out attack to take the town at daylight the next morning, December 19. In keeping with General von Manteuffel's original plan, the 2D Panzer Division was to continue along its route, bypassing Bastogne, and because the 5th Parachute Division was lagging far behind and thus exposing the south flank of the Panzer Corps, a regiment of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division was to screen that flank. Every other force available to the Corps was to drive for Bastogne. From Majer and along the next road to the south, the Panzer Division was to make a two-pronged thrust against the town, while 2 regiments of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division marched north through Longvilly to gain the village of Bastogne and pivot against Bastogne from the northeast and north. Neither von Wiltz nor the commander of the Volksgrenadiers, Colonel Cocotte, knew of the presence of Team Cherry along the Majer-Longvilly road, and they thought the Germans held Longvilly. That was not the case, but neither did the Americans, for with the first traces of daylight, all that was left of the 9th Armoured Division CCR began a disorderly exodus onto the road to Majer. Once on the road, the vehicles had no place to go, for on one side the ground dropped off sharply into a marsh, and on the other it rose steeply. The only exit from the road, a steep muddy farm track leading north to the hamlet of Arlencourt, was blocked by vehicles that had tried to get out that way during the night, and at Majer, the Germans still held the village. At daylight, the commander of Team Cherry's Armoured Infantry Company, Captain Ryerson, tried to execute his assignment of driving the Germans from Majer. Because of the obstacles on either side of the highway, Ryerson had trouble getting tanks and half-tracks turned around to make the attack. Their job was made the more difficult by the crush of CCR's vehicles, which in some places jammed the highway by moving abreast of Ryerson's vehicles in the other lane of the 2-lane road. Not until mid-morning was Ryerson able to get a small force headed for Majer with a medium tank in the lead. Some 300 yards outside Majer, the highway passed through a cut, and at the far end of it swung left. As the leading tank reached that point, a German anti-tank gun knocked it out. The tank burst into flames, partially blocking the road. Dismounting from the half-tracks, infantrymen tried to get past the burning tank, but small arms fire from Majer turned them back. Shells from 2 105 mm. Assault guns slowed the firing for a while, but each time the infantry tried to advance, it increased again. The infantry was still trying to make it when 2 half-tracks of the 482d Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, attached to CCR, raced forward, their drivers obviously determined to get out no matter what. Team Cherry's infantrymen shouted for the half-tracks to stop, but the drivers paid no heed. Just as they reached the bend in the road, they spotted the burning tank. Seeing that they were about to crash, drivers and the other men on the half-tracks jumped clear. With the half-tracks wrecked against the remains of the tank, no vehicle was going to get through. For much of the morning, the blocked American column escaped major interference from the Germans, for General von Wiltz's order to attack at daylight was unrealistic. During the night advance, troops had crossed and recrossed unit boundaries, and some order had to be established. So too, the division commanders felt compelled to delay in order to bring up food and ammunition and to afford their men at least a few hours' rest. It was late morning before Colonel Cocotte got his 2 Volksgrenadier regiments on the move, one to cross the Majer-Longvilly highway, the other to pass through Longvilly. Hardly had they begun to advance when they came under fire from Lieutenant Hyduke's force from Team Cherry on the high ground near the Grotto of St. Michael, the only American force along the highway occupying a viable fighting position. It took 3 hours for Cocotte to get an attack organized against Hyduke's force, but when it started, he had help from a portion of the Panzer Division, for General Bayerlein was determined to deal with the armoured force in his rear before committing himself to an all-out attack against Bastogne. For all Bayerlein's concern about that armoured force, he himself was at that point directing less than full attention to conduct of the battle. In a wood outside Majer, his troops had found a platoon from an American field hospital, and among the staff, a young blonde and beautiful American nurse attracted Bayerlein's attention. Through much of December 19th, he dallied with the nurse, who held him spellbound. When German artillery, Nebelwerfers, and tanks at last opened fire, they pummeled not only Lieutenant Hajduk's positions, but the trapped convoy of American tanks, half-tracks, self-propelled artillery, armored cars, trucks, jeeps and ambulances along the road between Longvilly and Majer. Here and there vehicles were soon burning, sending up great clouds of black smoke. Crews of the tanks and self-propelled artillery tried to fight back, firing at German tanks at long range and occasionally scoring a hit. But for the most part, the men and machines along the highway were helpless. Only along some short stretches of the road were there woods providing concealment, and only where the road passed through the cut near Majer was there any protection from the enemy fire. Lieutenant Hajduk, his men, armored cars, light tanks, and tank destroyers. He appropriated the lone surviving platoon of CCR's 811th Tank Destroyer Battalion, held near the Grotto of St. Michael for a little more than an hour, in the process knocking out 8 German tanks, but time finally ran out. Ordered by Colonel Cherry to fall back on the main body of Team Cherry, Hajduk had to order his remaining vehicles destroyed, for there was no way they could get past the double bank of vehicles along the constricted highway behind them. As darkness fell, somebody managed to push aside the vehicles blocking the steep track leading north from the highway to Arlencourt, and most of the self-propelled artillery and a few other vehicles inched out along that route. Many men headed cross-country on foot, among them the forward observer from the 109th Field Artillery, Sergeant Johnson. The coming of darkness also enabled Ryerson's armoured infantrymen at last to gain enough of a foothold at the edge of Majer to afford access to a dirt road leading west in the general direction of Bastogne. Once tanks had shoved aside the wreckage that blocked the highway at the cut in the road, Ryerson was able to get most of the surviving tanks and other vehicles out by that route. He got most of the wounded out the same way. Team Cherry and the 9th Armoured Division CCR paid dearly along the Majer-Longvilly road. The effect when combined with earlier losses at Antoniashof and Fayich was that CCR had virtually ceased to exist. Its armoured field artillery battalion got none of its howitzers out, although the corps battalion, the 58th, lost only 4 pieces. Team Cherry lost 175 officers and men, a fourth of the command's 7 light and 10 medium tanks, and 17 half-tracks. Under the circumstances, it was incredible that any men or vehicles escaped. To those casualties in the race for Bastogne would have to be added those incurred by the 28th Division's 110th Infantry and its attached and supporting units. And their losses were horrendous. The 110th Infantry lost 2,750 officers and men wounded, captured and killed virtually the entire regiment, and almost all its vehicles, and the 6 howitzers of its cannon company. Company B of the 103D Engineers was wiped out. The 109th Field Artillery lost 100 men, all the howitzers of 1 battery, and 2 of another. Except for 9 medium tanks, most of them crippled, and 5 assault guns, the 707th Tank Battalion lost 2 entire companies of medium tanks, a company of lights, and most of the crews. So too, the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion lost most of its men, and all but 6 of its towed guns, and a company of the 447th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion was also virtually erased. CCR's Company B, 2D Tank Battalion, lost 14 out of 17 medium tanks, and most of the crews. It was impossible to ascertain with accuracy what the fight cost the Germans, but losses of forces on the attack almost always exceed those of forces on the defence. What mattered in any case was not the losses in men, machines and guns, but the loss in precious hours. Had the 2D Panzer Division and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division crossed the Clerve River on the first day, December 16, the Germans would have captured Bastogne, and the Panzer Lehr Division would have been free to join the 2D Panzer Division in a drive to the Meuse with almost nothing in the way. Muddy roads, traffic jams, and difficulty in installing bridges across the Our River were partly responsible for the delay, but in the main, the men of the 110th Infantry were responsible, both on the first day and the second. All of that accomplished by easily the most overextended regiment on the American front, a regiment that only a few weeks before had had its guts ripped out in the Hurtgen forest. Those delays, combined with that imposed by the 9th Armoured Division CCR, enabled American reinforcements to win the race for Bastogne. Yet even after the 10th Armoured Division CCB arrived, the Germans still might have seized the town had it not been for Team Cherry, which for all the mischance and confusion along the road between Longvilly and Majer, had posed such a threat, real or imagined, that General Bayerlein had delayed the final thrust on Bastogne by his Panzer Lehr division. Perhaps a minor accolade might be accorded the unidentified American nurse, who diverted Bayerlein from focusing on his appointed task at a critical hour. Even after the arrival of troops of the 101st Airborne Division in their assembly area just outside Bastogne around midnight of the 18th, the town was still in dire peril, for only a combat command of armour, a lightly armed airborne division, a few artillery battalions, and a few other small units were available for Bastogne's defence. In winning the race for Bastogne, the Americans had nevertheless forced General von Manteuffel to face a critical decision: Bastogne, the Meuse, or both. Much would hinge on that decision, and it was not von Manteuffel's alone to make. When General Cotta, late on December 17th, obtained authority to pull the 110th Infantry behind the Clerve River, so little was left of the regiment that all Cotta could hope to do was delay for a time at his headquarters town of Wiltz. But why Wiltz? What would a delay at Wiltz accomplish? Holding Wiltz would block 3 minor roads that converged on the town, one climbing up from the valley of the Clerve at Wiltz, another meandering along a wooded cliff-like hillside high above the scenic trace of the Little Wiltz River from the confluence of the Wiltz and the Clerve at Kautenbach, and a third entering the town from the south off the Ettelbruck-Bastogne highway. Since the Germans had roads north of Wiltz leading to Bastogne, of which Cotta was surely aware by daylight of December 18th, and since delaying at Wiltz would leave nobody for blocking the principal Ettelbruck-Bastogne highway, who needed those roads through Wiltz. Holding the town however long would do nothing to keep the Germans out of Bastogne. It looked to be one of those decisions taken at any number of places in the early days of the German offensive that rested on nothing more logical than that American troops were there. Ergo, American troops should stay until the Germans kicked them out. Why not let Wiltz go, and instead defend the Ettelbruck-Bastogne highway? For anybody holding Wiltz, leaving that highway unprotected was in any case asking for disaster. With a population of 4,000, Wiltz was in essence 2 towns, the first a picturesque quarter, set high on a ridgeline and dominated by a chateau dating from the 13th century that overlooked the deep-cut valley of the Wiltz, and the second, a more prosaic quarter on low ground to the west, close along the river. The roads from Kautenbach and the Ettelbruck-Bastogne highway entered Upper Wiltz, that from Wiltz, Lower Wiltz. Having released the 110th Infantry's Company G from the mission of defending the division's command post, Cotta had left only a provisional battalion formed from headquarters and postal clerks, bandsmen, telephone linemen, drivers, MPs, whatever. Men of that battalion were digging in outside Wiltz during the morning of the 18th, when the Corps commander, General Middleton, sent help, the 600-man 44th Engineer Combat Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Clarion J. Keltseth. When Cotta learned that the 10th Armoured Division's CCB was moving up from the 3rd Army, he sent a liaison officer to the commander, Colonel Roberts, asking his help, in particular, to block the Ettelbruck-Bastogne highway. Roberts replied, sorry, he had his orders to go to Bastogne. From Wiltz, Cotta sent 2 companies of the engineers beyond the Little Wiltz River to block roads in the villages of Eschweiler and Erpeldange, leading up from the valley of the Clerve, while the 3rd Company and the Provisional Battalion constituted a reserve. The other 2 roads were of no particular concern at the moment, for Colonel Strickler and what was left of the 110th Infantry's 3D Battalion were soon to withdraw from Constam to help defend Upper Wiltz. Fire support was limited: 6 crippled Shermans and 5 assault guns of the 707th Tank Battalion, 6 towed guns of the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion, a few half-tracks of the 447th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, and a few armoured cars of the 28th Reconnaissance Troop. On the southeastern fringe of Upper Wiltz were the 105 mm howitzers of the 687th Field Artillery Battalion, which had fallen back in stages from their original firing positions near the southern end of the Skyline Drive. General Cotta was actually preparing a party to which no German commander wanted to come. General von Luttwitz of the 47th Panzer Corps had no interest in Wiltz other than to assure that nobody made a foray from the town into his flank, which was why he told the commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, Colonel Kokott, to withhold a regiment to keep an eye on it. So too, even though Wiltz lay in the zone of the 7th Army's 5th Parachute Division, the commander of that division, Col Ludwig Heilmann, had no designs on Wiltz. He wanted to move as fast as possible to blocking positions south of Bastogne, and that could best be achieved by bypassing Wiltz. Around midday on December 18th, it nevertheless appeared to the Americans that a battle for Wiltz was beginning with German attacks at Eschweiler and Erpeldange, but those attacks, which overran 2 of the towed tank destroyers, were actually a part of the Panzer Lehr Division's efforts to get out of the valley of the Clerve and gain Bastogne. There had been no contact for hours with the 28th Division's headquarters at Seebret, and advance parties sent to assembly areas west of Wiltz, to which the units in the town were to withdraw, returned with word that German paratroopers held them. It began to look as if Wiltz was surrounded. With that news, Strickler saw no hope of any orderly withdrawal. Instead, he told all commanders to try to pull back with their units intact. Should that prove impossible, they were to break into small groups and try to work their way westward. "Move out," said Strickler, as soon as ready. With 2 other officers of the 3D Battalion whom Major Milton had encountered at Strickler's headquarters, Milton began to make his way on foot back to his battalion at the road junction. On Strickler's orders, the battalion was to block the Ettelbruck-Bastogne highway until the units leaving Wiltz could get past. Executing that order presupposed the continued existence of the residue of his battalion. Not long after Major Milton first left for Wiltz, the men of his battalion, having begun to dig in on either side of the Ettelbruck-Bastogne highway at the road junction, heard the sound of marching feet. Because Milton had said that the men were to fire only if attacked, the officers passed the word to hold fire. A platoon of German paratroopers, each man pushing a bicycle, paraded past. When the Germans disappeared, the officers assembled the men on the highway with the idea of continuing to withdraw when heavy firing broke out in the direction of the Café Schumann crossroads. The men scurried for cover. When it became apparent that the firing was some distance away, they began to return to the road, but not all of them. At least half the men had decided to take off, to try to make their way out individually or in small groups. As the officers were preparing to march the remaining men toward the Café Schumann crossroads, headlights blazed behind them along one of the roads from Wiltz, and a burst of machine gun fire erupted. The firing came from an American armored car, which was leading a convoy of various types of American vehicles, all with headlights on. The men in the convoy were trying to brazen their way out. Having spotted 3 figures on the road, the machine gunners on the armored car had fired. Moments later, the headlights picked up the clump of men from the 3D Battalion. Recognizing them as Americans, the driver stopped. After a hurried conference, the 2 groups joined forces, and the men of the 3D Battalion clambered aboard the vehicles. One who clung to the side of the armored car in the lead was the erstwhile commander of Company L, Lieutenant Seaman. The 3 figures at which the armored car's machine gunner fired had in the meantime pulled themselves from the ditches, Major Milton and the 2 officers accompanying him. Arriving at the spot where Milton had left his men, they found nobody, and from the direction of the Café Schumann, they heard heavy firing. All that was left to do, the officers agreed, was to head west as best they could. Several days later, having picked up a few stragglers along the way, they arrived in Seebret. The artillerymen of the 687th Field Artillery Battalion reached the Café Schumann crossroads not long after full darkness descended. After placing outposts on all 4 points of entry to the crossroads, the battery commanders were getting ready to feed their men, then continue the withdrawal. At the outpost southeast of the crossroads on the Ettelbruck-Bastogne highway, small arms fire erupted. The platoon of German paratroopers that had just marched past Major Milton's men had reached the crossroads. The paratroopers quickly deployed and attacked. Spread out in fields and woods around the crossroads with the vehicles and artillery pieces, few of the artillerymen got involved in the fight, for the attack centered on the crossroads itself, where the only Americans were the officers and men of the battalion headquarters inside the café. As the firing began, the commander of Battery A, Captain Norris D. McGuinness, whose howitzers were beyond the crossroads in the direction of Bastogne, told his men to pull out. At that point, the battery had only 3 guns, which were destined to get out and eventually join the defenders of Bastogne. That was about all that was to be left of the 687th Field Artillery Battalion. The fight for the crossroads was in full swing, when up the road, in rear of the paratroopers, appeared the convoy of vehicles with headlights on. Stunned, the Germans at first held their fire, but when about half the vehicles had passed, they opened a blaze of fire. A Panzerfaust knocked out a half-track close behind two leading armoured cars, blocking the road. Another knocked out a tank farther back in the column. Fire from burp guns and machine guns swept men from the vehicles like autumn leaves before a strong wind. Most who survived the first fusillade dived for the ditches, but the ditches already belonged to the Germans. Small arms fire swept off most of the men clinging to the sides of the two leading armoured cars, but as the machine gunners worked their weapons relentlessly, a few continued to hold on, including Lieutenant Seaman. After what seemed an eternity, the two armoured cars finally broke free and were soon on their way toward Bastogne. Although hit in the left leg, Seaman was still holding on. At the crossroads, the screams and moans of the wounded mingled with the sound of continued firing. Inside the café, officers of the battalion headquarters considered their situation hopeless, and if anything was to be done for the wounded, they would have to surrender. The operations officer, Majer Edgar P. German, who spoke German, called for a ceasefire. The Germans complied. As the officers had hoped, the Germans helped move the wounded into the café, but for a time there was a question whether the able-bodied would survive. Overhearing German conversations, Major German detected that the paratroopers were under orders to speed their attack, and handling a large body of prisoners would delay them. A sergeant was adamant that the prisoners should be shot, but before he could act, a captain arrived. There would be no killing of prisoners, he decreed. In the melee, the 687th Field Artillery lost almost all its vehicles and all howitzers, but the three of Battery A. As for the men, many melted into the darkness, even as the surrender was taking place, and a few eventually made their way to safety. The Germans marched those who surrendered away from the crossroads and held them temporarily in a wood. From there, the men could hear renewed firing at the crossroads. That was German fire directed at another column of vehicles trying to escape from Wiltz, made up primarily of men of the Provisional Battalion who had climbed aboard anything with wheels or tracks that could still function. As the men in that convoy soon learned, the Germans had by that time installed mines across the main highway at the three-pronged road junction and backed up the roadblock with paratroopers and machine guns. When the leading half-track hit a mine, it blew up. The driver of the next vehicle, a half-track of the 447th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion, its quad 50s blazing, drove deliberately into the minefield. That half-track, too, went up in a deafening explosion, but it got rid of the mines. As the paratroopers fled, the sacrifice made by the men in the half-track provided a safe path for the vehicles that followed. The encouragement the rest of the men gained from that experience was short-lived, for just down the road was the Café Schumann crossroads. There, the paratroopers had erected another roadblock amid the wreckage of American vehicles and the bodies of American and German dead. As the convoy approached, a Panzerfaust hit the first armoured car at point-blank range. Turning over from the impact, the vehicle burst into flames, lighting the scene for German machine gunners so well that it was difficult for them to miss their concentrated target. Yet the Germans were dealing with near-desperate men, and amid the pandemonium, 36 of them rushed forward from the rear of the American column, firing and hurling grenades. The Germans fell back. Once a half-track cleared a passage through the wrecked vehicles, the convoy continued toward Bastogne. Again, the men's encouragement was to be short-lived. Only a few hundred yards beyond the crossroads, they came upon another roadblock. Vehicles burned, men fell left and right. The few survivors threw themselves into the ditches, then took advantage of the darkness to crawl away, eventually to get far enough from the scene of the carnage to dare to rise and run. Many were destined to blunder into German positions, or to come across German patrols, but some nobody would ever know just how many eventually made their way out. The experiences of the men in those two convoys were much like those of all others who tried to get away from Wiltz that terrible night, for there was no denying the inevitable consequences of an ill-advised decision to fight a delaying action with no provision for keeping escape routes open.